Hi, lovely people. So in this video, I wanted to answer a question that I got sent via email that was a really wonderful question that covered off so many things that I think many of us can relate to. And my answer, I wanted to share with you five key concepts. So one is what you can name, you can tame. I want to talk to you about your reticular activating system. Bear with me. About perfectionism, about readjusting our metrics, and about the 5-to-1 ratio. So these are the five things I want to share with you today. First, let me read out to you the question, which again, I think we can all kind of identify ourselves in some respect. I wonder what advice you could give me for dealing with not being enough. I feel like I don't deserve my husband. Like everyone looks at us as a couple and thinks, what is he doing with her? He's so nice and kind. Having had my baby, I feel like I'm going to get caught out for not being a good enough mum. And like I just don't know what I'm doing. When people say, oh, you're a natural, I almost feel guilty that they think that. I'm finding it really hard to readjust to this new idea of productive. I'm normally misproductive in work. And now it takes me an hour and 3 starts to hang out a load of washing, making me feel like I'm not enough at running my home either. I'm already telling myself I won't be able to cope when my maternity leave finishes. I know these are all separate issues, but I think when I look at it boils down to me being so scared that I'm not enough for everyone. My husband, my baby, my students, even myself, as I feel I cannot reach these standards I've set in all these areas. I really want to change, as I do not want my little girl to be so hard on herself like I am with me. And I'm scared she'll see and learn by osmosis when she sees me berate myself for things so much. I know that's really long-winded, but I was giving examples of where I feel it. I don't expect there to be a short answer to that question. And I'm here to give you some answers to that question because I think so many of us can see this, even if it's not with children, with babies, with husbands, whatever it is, where there are times where we just feel we're not enough, we're not reaching some kind of standard. So the first point that I want to cover is what you can name, you can tame. So we can see here an inner critic and imposter syndrome at work quite clearly, right? There are these things where our inner critic saying you're not doing well enough, you're not a good enough mum, you're not keeping up at home. And imposter syndrome is that sense that we're going to be found out at any moment, that we don't know what we're doing and that we aren't good enough and that other people are going to see that at some point. And there's a real sense of anxiety that comes with imposter syndrome. So what we can name, we can tame. Start calling it out. So when you notice inner critic thoughts like these or your imposter syndrome coming up and you can feel those kind of doubts seeping in, name them. Say, I notice this. Okay, I know that is my inner critic. I know that is imposter syndrome talking. A reminder that, especially when it comes to those things, that not all thoughts are true. Not everything we believe or we tell ourselves requires us to give it further attention. It doesn't require our buy-in. I would suggest also with things like that we look at where it may have come from in the first place. So we try to find what evidence have I been gathering in my life that says I'm not enough. I'm not good enough. Where has this idea come from? So look back at your childhood patterns, maybe at the parenting that was modeled to you or the things that were said to you by important adults in your life. Look back into your teenage years and ask yourself that question. Where have I felt this sense of not being enough? Or whatever it is for you, where have I felt the sense that I don't know enough or I'm not important or whatever it is that's coming up? See if I can find it. And then when it does come up, when we're able to name it, we can also link it. We can say, right, it makes sense that this comes up for me, given X, Y, and Z, given what I have been through in the past, given these experiences. But now I can choose to notice that, acknowledge it, and respond differently in my present. I can choose to act in ways that no longer support this. So that's a little quick note on the first point. What you can name, you can tame. I want to talk to you briefly about your reticular activating system. So this is a part of your brain, and one of its roles is responsible for looking for patterns. So looking for patterns in your life. Now, an example of this at work is, have you ever had this experience where you've either decided that you were going to buy a new car, or you did buy a new car? Let's say you bought a Nissan Dualis. I don't know. It's the first car model that came to my head. You buy this Nissan, and now everywhere you look, you see that. Suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, everybody has this car. Everyone's got the same car as me. How have I never noticed this before? It could easily make you feel like suddenly everyone has gone and bought it. The fact is, nothing has changed. There was always that many Nissans on the road, but now you're starting to observe a pattern. So this is going to be really useful if we need to find our car in the car park. So you can see why we'd need this ability to recognize patterns. This doesn't come in so handy for us when it comes to looking for patterns that show evidence of us not being enough, or of the world being scary, or an anxiety-provoking place, or worrisome. And it also really plays into feelings of depression or feeling stuck or low. So if the pattern that you start to look for are the times where you weren't enough, you will always see that. And the system creates patterns based on what it has already been involved with in the past. And that's especially true in terms of patterns that get stuck, that have been involved in anxiety or fear or trauma. So our system likes to think that whatever we've been through in the past, we're going to go through in the future, and it predicts that, and it sort of pushes that blueprint out into the patterns we begin to observe going forward. If you're someone who has spent a lot of time picking at yourself, picking at flaws, then that's a pattern that you'll continue to see, flaws in yourself. If you're always observing experiences where you feel like a failure or not enough, you will see that pattern playing out in your life going forward. So this is something that we just evolutionary biologically have. This is a system that is just running in our brain, that we really can't change the fact that our brain likes to look for patterns, right? This is something that we're going to do. But what we can do is use the system to our advantage by beginning a new pattern, actively looking for things that are okay, that we like about ourselves, that are going well. It's like actively looking for a different model of car, and we'll start to see it. And then it begins to look and seek and search more for that thing. So we have to sway our own temperament and biology by switching the focus. Look for new patterns. The third point to briefly go over is perfectionism. Now, this is something I cover in more detail in courses on my site. So I really, in terms of answering this question, just want to say that we need to just be really mindful of the standards that we set for ourselves. When it's a self-imposed perfectionism, quite often the standard or the bar that we hold for ourselves is so much higher than what we would expect of someone else in our life. We can be really hard on ourselves about anything we perceive to be some kind of failure or of not being enough. And there's no way we would put that onto someone else. This is something a lot of us do in our jobs, in our careers, and in our parenting, which is like a career as well, with kind of less remuneration. Where we expect ourselves to perform at this level that might not be realistic. And yet we would not expect that of a colleague, or of another fellow parent, or another mum who we're friends with. So can we be really mindful of the standards that we set for ourselves? And can we change the mantra to practice makes progress, not perfection? I much prefer progress over perfection, because perfection can make us, this idea of perfectionism can actually stop us in our tracks. It can make us feel really stuck, and we can end up procrastinating or not starting things at all for fear that we're not going to do it right. We can end up withdrawing from parts of our life because we can't bear the discomfort of not doing things perfectly. Perfectionism is often wrapped up in fear of not being enough, fear of being judged, fear of being seen, fear of failure. There's so much fear and control that goes into oh my goodness, perfectionism. It was kind of the perfect word to say imperfectly. It's like a real Porky Pig moment. Perfectionism. Sorry, I've just enjoyed myself a bit there. Let's move on. So here's something for you to try when it comes to perfectionism, is do things imperfectly on purpose. So find things in your life that you can do and make a bit of a mess of, or do with all of their failings, and do it on purpose and sit with the discomfort that that brings. So know that the outcome is not supposed to be, oh, it felt great and maybe it came out perfectly anyway. That's not the outcome. We're not looking for the end product. We're looking for the feeling of being really uncomfortable and sitting with that, and then doing the thing imperfectly and coping with that too, being able to sit in that. So try this out a little bit. You might write an email and not spell check it. You might leave some dishes on the bench overnight. Whatever it is that you do, try it out. Get used to doing things at a different standard. Okay, next point number 4. We have to readjust our metrics or our standards. Okay, so in terms of guilt, which comes with parenting and mum stuff, but some of us just experience guilt across many areas of our life, know that this is something that everyone experiences, especially with parenting, and that you're not alone in that. And we also need to then readjust your kind of standard or your metric of success. So if you're somebody, and this is the perfect example with this question, who's come from being really good and having a lot of achievement in your career, switching into parenting is a really hard shift, because suddenly nothing's tangible in terms of measuring success or achievement. And in fact, as you mentioned, as the question mentioned, you can take 3 hours to start a load of washing. And so that feels like a failure when you compare it to this old standard or metric of what success meant or what achievement meant. So it's really important, not just with parenting, but with our journey in life, that we are able to change and readjust the way we evaluate things. What worked for us then is not always going to work for us going forward. And it's easy to get fixated on old ways of doing things, or old measurements of success, or fixated on goals that we might have set for ourselves that we didn't meet. It might not be that you didn't meet it or you're no longer achieving. It might be that success or your goals look different now, and you haven't caught up and pivoted to land with these new ones. So be really mindful that you have to be fluid and be able to readjust your standards and your goals and the way you evaluate yourself. And that's also true for things like boundaries. Sometimes we set a strong boundary that we then change later in life. Sometimes when you're a little kid, you don't like mushrooms, and then as an adult, you like mushrooms. It's okay that you change your mind and that things change. Be compassionate with yourself about making those shifts. And the final and 5th point I wanted to make is the 5-to-1 ratio. Now, you might have heard of this already. And this is a ratio that you may have heard being spoken about when it comes to a successful relationship or about working with children or parenting. So the idea of this 5-to-1 ratio, let's look at it first from a perspective of a relationship. When researchers observed marriages and ones that succeeded versus ones that failed, they saw that there was a difference in the ratio of positive feedback versus criticism or nitpicking or whatever it was. So they noticed that if a couple had a ratio of 5-to-1, so it was kind of like 5 positive interactions or 5 pieces of compliment, and that could be any different love language. It might be 5 hugs that you give, 5 positive interactions to every 1 less positive maybe, or a criticism that you give. That ratio was a good kind of factor in determining that the marriage would be successful, because there was so much positive, right, that outweighed any criticisms or blips. And less than that, it kind of, the successes of how successful the relationship would be went down. So it's a ratio that we also use in parenting or working with children, is, can I try to give my child or the kids I'm working with 5 pieces of praise or 5 positive interactions to every 1 less positive one, or criticism or adjustment or correction or whatever you want to call it. Now, this doesn't mean we have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 before we're allowed to do this one. It's okay if you've had to do 3 in a row. It means, is there a general sense that the positives outweigh the negatives in the relationship? And I want to propose to you that you can use the 5-to-1 ratio with yourself, and that this is going to be a really important thing to do when it comes to boosting self-worth, and when it comes to starting to shift that narrative of I'm not enough. So if that was the narrative, I'm not enough, we want to look for 5 examples of being enough to every 1 time we berate ourselves for not being enough, to every 1 time we listen to our imposter syndrome or our inner critic. So ask yourself right now, if I was to apply this metric, this ratio to myself, am I meeting a 5-to-1 ratio in the right direction? Or is it that I'm 4 negatives and 2 positives? Because of course we're going to sway towards feeling down or feeling depressed or feeling anxious or not believing in ourselves if we are by and large focusing on the negatives. So it's that reticular activating system again. Can I switch my focus to find a new pattern where the pattern is I'm looking for the positives versus these things? So I'm going to leave you with those 5 concepts to have a little think about, maybe to journal on, maybe to rewatch this if you need to. Maybe you just want to go back and listen to my moment again, because that was fun for everyone. Can you see how I fixated on the one? So thank you for being here and having a listen. Thank you for the question. I hope that this answer was helpful in providing some possible things to start thinking a little more about. And for those who are listening and who hadn't, of course, submitted that question, I'm sure you can find that these things could be applicable to whatever it is you're experiencing too. All right, lots of love and warm fuzzies.